Do you have any idea how intimidating this interview was for me? Here I am sitting down talking to an acclaimed documentarian, thinking, am I asking the right questions? Thinking, I'm going to have to edit this later into some acceptable form where he's not going to be ashamed to have his name attached to this. And to make it worse, my lighting is trash and my audio falls out of sync in some parts. I guess I could spin it and say that this is my way of making my guests look even better by comparison. Although I didn't have to do that in this regard. Eric Walter is the epitome of professionalism. There's no way I need to help him. His documentary, My Amityville Horror, is incredible. We talk a lot about that. And that's not to say you have had to have seen it before you watch this interview. There's nothing in here that's going to spoil anything. But if you have seen it previous, then you will get a lot of really great insight into how it became a documentary, some of the drama off camera, some of the things that didn't make it into the film. And if you haven't seen it, then I encourage you to do that after you watch this interview. You'll go in with a little more insight into the whole process. It's really incredible. I think the story about the story, The Amityville Horror, is even better than the book. And it captured the world's curiosity, and it's thrown a long shadow all these years. If you go to Wikipedia, you'll see sequels on The Amityville Horror that go all the way to like 2021. So it's really cool. I'm thrilled I had the chance to sit down and talk to Eric. And we also talk about his next documentary, The Dark Side of the Mountain. So stay tuned, watch that, check it out. Brilliant guy doing great objective journalism. What really happened? Will we ever know what really happened in that house in the late 70s? So check out the interview, check out the book. He wrote the afterword. Stay tuned for more books, more interviews, and more blather at the Jeff Word.
For once, I'm not talking to myself. It's time to go beyond the book and get over your shelf.
There's so much material to mine with just the subject matter that I think. Anyway, that's just
definitely. How much time do we have?
I know. When I was watching this, I'm like, oh my gosh. And how much is Eric going to be willing to say? Because so much of this depends on your objectivity. You, as a journalist, as somebody exploring these things, you're presenting the evidence and all these things I want to talk about. So I'll probably forget to circle back because I am not a documentary filmmaker. And I'm going to have to beg your forgiveness in advance when I do record this and edit it and send it to you, because there's a special nerve-wracking element when you're dealing with somebody who does this professionally and so well. So
thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's I think today, unfortunately, a lot of documentary filmmakers forget the use of objectivity, especially in matters of the paranormal or true crime or any sort of controversial subjects. But I've taken, definitely have a lot of pride in the fact that it's been recognized that My Amityville Horror did or was very fair to its subject matter, despite the fact that it, number one, had a very difficult subject in the man, Daniel Lutz himself. Number two, the fact that your willingness to even listen or accept anything that's being said by this subject is, it depends on your belief if these things can actually occur, which I found myself actually quite up against the wall on that subject as well. I mean, as I talk about in the afterword with the book, the Amityville Horror, the book, Jansen's novel, as well as the subject of the true case itself being the DeFeo murders in 1974 and the subsequent haunting allegations in 75, 76 have stood the test of time, and if something that, in order to mine those subjects truly, certainly when I got involved, and it was more than, it was way before Wikipedia was a thing, and
yeah.
It was more, looking at the, actually during the 90s, actually for myself, is just looking at the book just as it's just in and of itself, is a fascinating testament to the case, but certainly many of the things that are talked about stretch the imagination and the believability factor. And so I was and with any case that you approach this way, have to be skeptical, but not so much as just going out to, we're going to prove that this didn't happen, more of like being open-minded and listening. A lot of this has to do with, again, people's religion, and also willingness to believe that whatever, or interpretation of how things were being perceived at the time.
Yeah.
And I think often, certainly one of the things that George Lutz, the late George Lutz, who the stepfather of Daniel, Christopher, and Melissa, as well as the husband of Kathy Lutz, and sort of the main voice in this story for so many years until his passing in 2006. He certainly spoke a lot about the fact that there was so much confusion in trying to communicate about these subjects, and feeling almost like an alien in and of himself, trying to go public with this. And I think so much of my interest beyond the case itself was in answering that question: what happens to a family unit who decides to go public? And I think the Amityville Horror is the ultimate example of what not to do in that case. I think the Amityville Horror, the book, really, quite frankly, as entertaining as it is, really represents the true horrors represented in that book. That it destroyed their public image, or their ability to move past this, until the day both George and Kathy passed away. And so the kids still live with this every day.
So I assume now we are in the interview. What I grew up believing in ghost stories. My family, like, these are ghost stories they told for generations, and they were just, as a kid, you believed them. Like, it became family lore. So I'm predisposed growing up to believing these things.
Right.
What are you seeking to do by a documentary about bizarre cold cases, unexplained phenomenon, and witness psychology, which I'm interested in understanding what that even is? But what's your goal, and what are you hoping to do as the end result?
I think, each story, in terms of my goals personally with each case, it certainly evolves as you go into these things, and not each is the same. I mean, as a filmmaker, you certainly have a set of goals. As a documentarian, a certain an initial interest or a spark that gets you involved in these things. And certainly anyone who getting involved in the Amityville case, or any sort of controversial topic of supernatural or crime, anything like this, certainly requires an immense interest to take you all the way from the beginning to the end point. But by the time, a lot of these films and projects, and I would say any writer or any artist that goes through these processes recognizes that, your initial interest, a project or a film takes on a life of its own, and you end up finding out that the real story reveals itself through the process of making the film. And I would say with My Amityville Horror, I had a passionate interest in the book, in the story, what was perceived to be a true story of Amityville, for many, many, many years prior to when I was a child, and having read the book, and it thoroughly terrifying me. Had never really forgotten that, and then during my teenage years had gotten back involved in reading it, and really kind of reassessing what, trying to parse fact from fiction, and being a native East Coaster, originally from Maryland. New York wasn't that far away from me, so I made it, the trek up there many, many different times. And
so you went to 112 Ocean View?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Ocean Avenue. And
Ocean Avenue.
Also went to the Historical Society in Amityville, and, tried to talk to different people who were there, where most people in the community now do not want to talk about this. That was something I found out very quickly, because, by the time I came around, I'm the third, fourth generation in, and it's already being, it's thoroughly a myth, a myth. Its mythos have been built up to the point that many in the community refuse to hear any of it or talk about any of it. This is all BS, and nobody, please leave. But I didn't leave, and I would always become more interested at the fact that people would push you away. And I'm certainly not by any stretch of imagination the first person to have that experience. Anyone who's been involved with this case, and really a lot of cases, not just Amityville, but I think Amityville is the most notorious for being that village, being an idyllic coastal community, who to have this dark cloud of first, the tragic murders that occurred there in 1974 at the hands of the eldest son, Ronald DeFeo Jr., who had murdered his, brothers and sisters and two parents inside the house.
Yeah.
On November 13th, 1974. And those murders really, certainly he was convicted, received 6 life terms, and in my view, was responsible for the murders. But there's been a lot of criticism of those, the official theories, whether there was, a second person that helped, whether there's, Ronnie himself even went down, to suggest that his sister had helped him commit the murders. He's changed his story, or he's now passed away. But, he had changed his story so many different times that it's hard to buy anything that he, or accept anything that he had said.
Yeah, it's impossible to fathom somebody could do that. And then the way it was done, they were all in their sleep, they weren't drugged. And it was with a shotgun that should have sounded the alarm to anybody who was like, it's just
exactly. It was a 35 Marlin rifle. And
okay.
They were able to prove that there was no silencer in the weapon. None of the victims were seemingly have awoken, or there's been some debate about that, whether anybody was awake. I know that they were able to show that Louise DeFeo, the mother, had sat up in the bed and looked at the killer as she was shot.
Wow.
They've also debated, why did this was on, the murders of the parents took place in the master bedroom, which was on the 2nd floor. First seemingly came the father, Ronald Sr., and then Louise DeFeo, the mother. And then he went upstairs and killed the 2 boys and his 2 sisters, and one of his sisters was on the 3rd floor, Dawn. But none of these children seemingly had gotten up from bed. They were all found laying on their stomachs. And there's been, debate about whether they were just so terrified, knowing that he was such a volatile figure. There were a lot of problems in the house, fights, and that probably doesn't go anywhere near as close to explain really what was going on. Just the violence and the drug abuse with Ronnie, and the violence from the father, physical abuse that had happened against the mother and the children, and there was just an upheaval going on in that house. And this was sort of this is where the straw that broke the camel's back that night, unfortunately. But Ronnie, during his trial, claimed to have heard, voices telling him to commit the murders.
Yeah.
Later, he came out and, as well as, his attorney, William Weber, had come out and said this was, that they had concocted this to try to throw everything against the wall to try to make him seem for an insanity defense. I mean, how do you explain this ever occurring? But Ronnie's case, the crazy part about it is that truly, whether he's told so many stories and we're not able to parse what's truth and fiction, and that's my own view, is that maybe somewhere within the lines he has told, and I think he was solely responsible for the murders, because I've never seen enough evidence to prove otherwise. But it also is hard to explain how those children just stayed in bed during the entire time. And there's been, some evidence that he went around and cleaned certain things up, and, he disposed of the rifle in the river, the Amityville River. He threw it in, off the bulkhead, and then he went into Brooklyn and dropped his bloody clothes as well as his shells for the gun casing and the rest of it into a sewer grate. And so, it's just
you can't claim insanity when you do those things,
right?
And so supernatural is your next door down. I wasn't crazy. I'm not crazy now, But during the thing, I was a puppet, and so I had to
Right.
obey these forces.
Right.
And I think at the time that was 74, 75.
1974, yeah, and his trial went into 75. And the Lutzes moved into the
Uh-huh.
house on December 18th, 1975, and
Yeah.
left the following month. They only were there 28 days.
Right. That blew my mind, because for a lot of people, Amityville Horror it casts a long shadow, and whether or not you read the book or saw the movie,
Mhm.
you kind of know the story. You know about the flies, you know about the window crushing fingers, you know about the secret room, and all these things that have, just through osmosis, it seems, have been absorbed into our, collective consciousness, this archetypal sort of story. But
Well, I think that's part of what's fascinating about it, actually, and I think I might have mentioned earlier, is the fact that Jay Anson's novel, Frozen Time,
yeah.
a certain timeline that was admitted to be um, fictionalized. I mean, Anson. So I should back up a little bit. With anybody listening to this, probably is already very familiar with the things that you mentioned. Is that the Lutzes moved into the house in December 18th, 1975, and had, from the very outset, I mean, the very first day, um, had alleged to have gone through this slow burn of pretty rapid succession paranormal activity that grew and grew and grew, to the point that they weren't communicating with each other about the things they were each experiencing, some of which, happened to others, as well as, Father Ralph Pecoraro, who was a priest, who had worked, was a friend of George Lutz's, had come on a friend of Kathy's and friend of the family's, had suggested that the house needed to be blessed. And so on
Yeah.
the day they moved in, they had this, priest showed up to bless the house. And during this, he's on camera admitting that he had heard a voice commanding him to get out as he was doing a blessing in what would have been what would have been the Lutz's sewing room. It actually was John DeFeo's bedroom, or the boys' bedroom,
Wow.
where they had been murdered in. And he had heard a voice commanding him to get out, and that he had felt, he said, a hand slap him in the face.
Yeah.
And that he had been so shaken by it, of course, he left, but he refused to tell the Lutzes why he acted calmly, but didn't elaborate. He didn't tell them what had happened, apparently, but until much later. And he was actually surprised that the family was still there by that point, which I always found sort of strange. If I had gone through these types of that type of incident, I certainly may have had a private conversation later or something to warn them. But so this was alleged to have happened, and then just all manner of paranormal escalation was alleged to have occurred, to the point that, as I mentioned, they weren't communicating. George said that he would go for days of just staring into the fireplace and just being obsessed with keeping the fire going. There were like this gelatinous green droplets of slime that were found upstairs later on in their stay along the carpets. Of course, the movie fictionalized this heavily, to the point that we had green slime and blood running down the walls. And this, of course, was just part of Hollywood's elaboration into the thing.
Right.
But George also described this epoxy-like black liquid that would be coming out of the keyholes and some of the doors in the house, and the toilets themselves, like the porcelain itself, had turned black, and they cleaned it and it would reappear. Of course, this is another thing that Hollywood, of course, turned into black ooze coming out of the toilets. There's a lot of things, and the reason I mention all this, a lot of things that have become part of our memory of the case when you say the Amityville Horror, and that was a hoax because this never happened. Well,
Right.
it really takes a lot of parsing out what Jay Anson created, what subsequently the screenwriter for the Amityville Horror, the movie, created, and then there was this onslaught of decades, and it's still not stopped, because at this point the Amityville name has become kind of a schlocky B horror movie. There's every crazy sequel known to mankind is coming out with this Amityville label. So it's just gotten so far away from what actually happened. Yeah, again, the mythos of the case is actually quite fascinating. And again, psychologically, how does that impact the participants even within the case? And I am getting a little ahead of myself, but that really is where it generated. That's where my interest really came in, because very early on, it's very clear to me that there's no way to prove any of this happened.
No.
I ultimately do believe that, and I can't prove it, but it is my feeling based on the Lutz's actions after leaving the house, that I do believe they were frightened. I do believe that something happened, that they felt they couldn't live there anymore and they had to leave. Do I believe everything that's been said about it? And no, I think that it got to a point where they were repeating fictionalized versions. I mean, I think there's evidence to show that. But I do think that at the genesis of when they left the house in January in 76, that yes, that they were frightened of something. And I don't think anyone who had sold both he and Kathy had recently gotten married, and both sold their homes to purchase this house for $80,000, which was a dramatically reduced price because of its history. They claimed that they hadn't known the history of the house until they were going and seeing. That is something I also find a little hard to believe.
I was going to ask
knowing
you
George Lutz's background as well. George had an interest in the occult. That's something that has come out in years since.
So that's not just Danny's assertion. That's been, have other people corroborated that he had his interest in the occult? Do you think that was why he wanted that house?
It's really hard to say if that's why he wanted the house. I wouldn't go that far myself. There's been a lot of opinions about that. There's been a lot of different relationships he had and just interests he had that have been alleged. But again, it falls into the same problem of George is now gone. It would be wrong of me to say, yeah, George did that for, I don't know that. But my own feeling is that, putting the likelihood is that, Christopher, Daniel's brother, has come out and said that also that George had an interest in the occult way before this was going on. There have been friends and people of George's who have come out as well and said that George had an active interest. He was the guy was a pretty, he was an ex-Marine, he was a biker. He had interest in seemingly in occult activities. There was even an occult bookshop on Long Island run by a gentleman named Ray Buckland, who alleged that George would frequent his shop all the time, and that he had an interest. And this was all allegedly going on before they moved into 112 Ocean Avenue. So, put two and two together, it seems, George had an interest. So does that play into it? I mean, I would say that, it does play into it, because if you're even if these things are, let's say, all happening, we are levitating in our beds, my wife is turning into a vision of an old hag, all these things that were said to have happened, your belief in this, whether it's you causing it, as the two boys alleged, or not, or it's just my willingness or my openness to this happening. And that should be mentioned too. Both Kathy and George have talked about they were practicing transcendental meditation at the time, and they were opening themselves up to it. They felt they opened themselves up to, or were susceptible, Kathy quoted,
became a doorway
at the time, in some way, for whatever was going on in the house, whatever was in the house. They felt they opened themselves up to it and allowed this to go through them, and that this was all happening.
Wow.
But a lot went on in those 28 days, or not. It depends on your perspective. I would say that I do think some things happened, but I don't think it's as much as Jay Anson or anyone in Hollywood has ever made it out to have been.
Yeah,
true.
I mean, that's 28 days that have lasted 40 years, 50 years. It's amazing to me that that was only that much time. And so I have several questions, but I understand, when you make a documentary or when you tell a story, it's easier and more effective to focus on a person and understand that. I mean, was Danny always going to be the main focus with maybe his siblings weighing in to kind of check him or verify, or was it like, were you trying to get as many people involved and Danny was the only one willing to
Well,
participate?
I was trying to get some of those like factual things about the case out of the way before I delved into my part of it, but it's just because the understanding of the history is so much into how this even happened. But the short version of it is really, as I mentioned, was someone who was fascinated with the case, and I had actually started a website for the case and was interested in as a young person putting out research I was finding in, but with always a sort of journalistic sort of objectivity of like, here's everything, you pull from what.
Mhm.
I think our slogan at the time was America's most famous haunted house controversy. And it's true, that is sort of still to this day, Amityville is the preeminent haunted house controversy. But because of that site that I did, and I was going on radio shows and talking about this in a way of just with the research we had, myself and my research partner had done at the time. And lo and behold, one day, I was contacted by a gentleman who was friends with Daniel Lutz, or so he claimed. And I was sort of, you always have to be skeptical of these things. But he sent me, he sent me a photograph of him, and I knew right away, like, wow, because you'd never seen Daniel specifically. Christopher had come out and he actually sued George for, the things for a whole bunch. There was always fighting going on between, and I'd always heard negative things about the boys' views towards what George was doing. And, the constant, the remake of the film came out, caused a whole nother resurgence, even though as horrible as that film was in 2005, it caused a great amount of, a whole resurgence of this interest in this case came about following that. And this sort of, I was one of these people who was, on George's forum and researching, talking with these people and people who also knew their stuff and involved in the case. But there was all this drama and just to get in the ins and outs of what happened with this what happened or didn't happen between the DeFeo case and the Lutz's case and onward. I mean, I'm getting a little off track, but basically there's so much to it that, I spent years parsing out the truth and fixing. So by the time that Daniel Lutz got in touch with me, I had already had a sort of viewpoint of what I thought. And was actively impassioned about the case. I won't, as far as my objectivity, I was always objective about it. And, I would say I was more skeptical than accepting of the official account. But, I always did. Again, I always had this feeling that the Lutzes truly were affected by it. And because the children, even Christopher, had come out and talked a little bit about it publicly, I still was interested in knowing, hey, well, what did the oldest son think? Because Danny was, about 10 years old at that time. So when we started communications, I found out, he was at the time, he was in Whitestone, New York, which is, just at Queens, New York, he's right there in the city. And so I began visiting him and conducting interviews, not on camera, but just by audio, just with a digital recorder, and just began talking to him. And I was really thrown off by just the amount of, I felt, psychological trauma that had been inflicted upon this person. He was not a calm and collected individual. I mean, I think the truly, despite your feelings about him, because a lot of people have a lot of feelings about Danny, and the whole Lutz family in particular, but he was angry. I mean, he was extremely angry. And for some, I can see why, part of his anger was, I never got to tell my story, yet my name was used in the original novel. My name is synonymous with this. So he had this complex buildup of not separate. I mean, that would come out in conversations in a genuine way. And again, our relationship went on for quite a bit of time before we even rolled any camera. I mean, years before we even started working on this. So we, you know, my interviews was a process of getting to know him, to getting to sort of trust that this wasn't a money grab or something.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, anybody making independent documentaries, it's
You
not.
didn't give him like 7 figures for you know,
No.
you didn't quit UPS?
We
No.
didn't have the 7 figures, but for sure it was something coming from a place of passion with me. It was a place of cathartic
Yeah.
exercising his demons, really, at least he alleges. Now I do feel that yes, he wanted to come forward with his story, have his say. I find it convenient that he was doing this after George had passed away. He would probably really have heard me saying that, but I think it is interesting and telling that neither of the boys came forward with their full story until George had passed away. And that, you know, that's just an observation. I don't know, but many people were afraid of George. I mean, he was a domineering, and I know Danny would be the first one to tell you that he was not afraid of him. And I think he made it pretty clear, but
50 times he tried to kill him.
He talks about literally wanting to kill the guy.
Yeah.
He talks about his mother letting him go to just roam the streets and become, you know, do whatever, finding his own way in life at a very young age. And, you know, you'd wonder if that's true. Any mother that would allow that to happen really had to have been in a tough place for that to have been. And from my understanding, that did happen, having talked to their kids and everything else.
I mean, what the documentary did, I think, wonderfully was put a human face on this case, and whether or not, and it's almost like when you watch a documentary, whatever happened in that house is almost arbitrary, because the impact on these kids, and you know, I think at the time, I was born in 72, so I understand in 1974, even in 1984, divorce was not that common. And there was a stigma, and there was that trauma with dealing with that. And then the whole thing about how George had to own them on the adoption papers. This way of, you didn't kill my father, but wow, you might as well have. You've come in, you've sort of blanked my past. And then to have this happen and further steal his story, his voice. Wow. And well,
I appreciate you observing that, because, you know, in the years subsequent, you know, we all grow as we, you know, it's been several years since I made the film, and you know, it's always like, oh man, if I had done this or done that. But the one thing that I really wish that I really felt that came out of it is that it was raw in its. I tried to stay out of his way and allow him to be the film to feel sort of raw and open, and not heavily edited in terms of trying to make it an entertaining ghost story, because honestly, the true horror was what really happened in the aftermath of this case. I mean, I tend to be more skeptical about the things that he actually said happened in the house for many reasons, and not because I'm saying that he's making them up, but because he's been living in the shadow of this suggestion his entire life of being told this happened. But as you mentioned, I think one of the nuances of the case, and if you look at such an angry adult is sitting there knowing, and I can tell you this because some of this stuff didn't even make it into the film, but having conversations with him about his biological father, who Danny, we tried to get involved. We wanted him to meet with him, because I saw this sort of arc in, you know, that the father had been replaced by George, and that is what had, and then yes, as you mentioned, the haunting, this unexplainable event, volcano event happens. Then now you're a public figure. Your parents decide to go public with the story, are going on book tours, and you are being left behind. I mean, I don't want to say that I think that they did this with any malicious intent, but it's certainly the ramifications of which no one could have foreseen, especially on the children. So yeah, it wasn't my objective to try and force down the throat as many wanted, and reading, you know, people's reviews when the film came out. I mean, I think most people got it. Well, a lot of people want this story to be true. They don't want to. The Amityville Horror is something that people have fun thinking that this really happened, or the very opposite. They want to fight it, and this could be fodder for them saying this was all made up. And this guy, well, I can tell you that it wasn't some big money making affair to anyone. But
Yeah.
I do know that, and it is one thing I am proud of, this as a tragic, despite it may be, the fact that we were able to get, as you said, a human face and try to shine a real light on like the confusion, the fact that this person, I think Danny would pass a polygraph test. I think he fully believed all this stuff
Flying colors, because it doesn't matter. Like the truth, we all have a story, and it might not necessarily be the truth, but you might believe it, and you might say, like, yeah, if you, I thought that too, and that was it. So was that your voice in that part of the documentary where you're asking him,
going, yeah, yes, that's me.
No. I thought you handled
Yes,
it
that was
perfectly,
me.
because he, like you said, he's angry and he felt like a hostile witness.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's like, well, it's like rescuing a stray.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. He was a hostile witness, I can tell
Yeah.
you. Because I was being, that was the first day of filming, by the way.
No.
I was being threatened as soon as the camera stopped. And I mean, everyone's looking, the DP and everyone's looking at me like, what did you just do? Because he walked out. He walked out at the end. It was like an 8-hour day. And yeah, as I mentioned, that was the first day. And yeah, no, he was, yelling at me in the parking lot, accusing me of trying to set him up. I was not trying to set up anything or looking for anything. It was some of it, I believe, and I don't remember now, it's been a while since I've seen it, but I believe we cut out the opening question, which I had prefaced the fact that his parents, George and Kathy, had taken polygraph tests and passed the polygraph test in 1979. This was part of they had agreed and wanted to do professional polygraph tests. And this was part of the film company, that it was part of a marketing thing for the film.
Yeah.
Say that they passed polygraph. Well, they were administered by, some very qualified individuals, and they did pass the tests. And I prefaced that in my question. Your parents did this. Would you be willing to take a polygraph test? Well, he took it the exact wrong way. He took it as, you were accusing me. You're going to say that I'm a liar. Well, I don't know. I read, a lot of people did. I read in reviews and things since that people said, it was all BS because he says he wouldn't take it. Well, if you listen to it, it actually says yes, but he just runs over his words a little bit. But I think he took it as an affront on his credibility, as I was questioning your credibility, which to me is the crux of the whole matter. He's lived his entire life being doubted. He talked about being a child being made fun of for this. He talked about being a UPS guy and people saying that, knowing him as the Amityville guy, which, I always had to question, well, you had to have told him that.
Right. Nobody would know. Right.
So one of the interesting things, psychological bits that I really loved that I opened the film is that he viewed this as a gift in his life, that this was a gift, this was something that he had, this notoriety was somehow something that he was fond of, but it was also tragic. So it was this constant fatal attraction of, and I feel like and I don't want to speak for any of them, but I feel Christopher has unfortunately suffered from the same thing, seeing his actions over the years, just telling, wanting to tell a story than not. He just recently came out and did a show and is telling his side of the story as well. So it's like this, there's this constant like wanting to tell the real story, and there's something I'm going to reveal about what I know versus what the public thinks happened. And I think for Danny, it was less about the house, and it was more about his relationship with George and the fact that his life had been decimated in his view. This guilt, this victim sort of complex had been built up by, as you mentioned, his father being taken out of the picture and replaced with this militant,
Giant.
allegedly abusive person, which
Yeah.
again, these are allegations. I
Right.
can't say that this happened. And that certainly, many people who knew George have had a lot to say and are quite upset with those things that Danny did say. However, I know his brother has said the same things, and I've heard a lot of things, from various people that knew the family. And I wouldn't be hard to see how some of those things could have been going on. And you just have to wonder how much all of this firestorm of all this, this tumultuous change was going on, and on top of this unexplainable event that happens, how that shapes someone. So that is what, as its title suggests, My Amityville Horror. That really is what my goal was. And I know, and it was really to kind of get out of Danny's way and let him tell his story. But yes, we have to inject sort of objectivity. We had people like Elizabeth Loftus, who in the film talk about false memories being implanted.
It's hard to believe that Amityville Horror would be a 50-year story if it wasn't the Lutzes moving into that house.
Well, that's why I've always had an open mind to them. I mean, I am critical of a lot of things that they did afterwards. While I can understand losing your house and losing the the money, and giving the house back to the bank, and their belongings, they left everything there. And they moved clear across the country to California, where, for a time they were, living on food stamps, and had a great deal of financial difficulty. So I can't, to me, it seems understandable, their motivation in wanting to go public. I don't want to get too off what we were just talking about, but there was a lot of motivation for, at the time that they left the house in the immediate aftermath, they actually reached out to William Weber, who was the defense attorney for DeFeo. They claimed to say that whatever affected us, that he had to have been affected by this. He might not be, guilty of what this might have affected him, because George, don't believe, ever went on the record to really say that he was having the similar thoughts or feelings, but it was sort of suggested in other interviews. I remember Art Bell sort of was asking him directly, if you remember his show. Of course, I was a huge fan back
Coast
in the
to Coast.
The original Coast to Coast.
Yeah.
And in fact, that was the first time I ever heard George speak, was on his 2002, like the first live interview I ever heard with him. And that one really got me really fascinated with it, even more so, kind of getting into it. But yeah, he did seem to suggest in that interview that there were thoughts that he was uncomfortable with talking about, that it seemed to suggest that maybe he was having dark thoughts like Ronnie DeFeo had about murdering his family, and this opening up this, dark place in his mind. And one can wonder what would have happened if they had stayed. However, and that was part of the reason he alleged they had to get out of there. They had taken this meeting with William Weber, who was DeFeo's defense attorney. Yeah. Weber was at the time involved in writing a book about the DeFeo case, and wanted to use George and Kathy's testimony as an addendum, an extra chapter in his book. He wanted to include it in his book, and he had presented them a contract that really bothered the Lutzes, that that they were to appear at any time to talk about this, and that everything they said had to been 100% the truth, and that right, that they were going to be involved in this. And they actually, by their own admission, had sat with William Weber, and which has now become the famous, many bottles of wine sort of story. I don't know if you or your listeners are familiar with that, but basically Weber and George and Kathy had met privately and had been talking about this, and these were recorded sessions where they were drinking wine and talking about throwing around ideas for how they could expand the story.
Oh,
and that
wow.
that Weber had all these ideas of how they could add, things to their story, and the Lutzes, by their own admission, engaged in these discussions. Now, what does that tell you?
Mm-hmm.
Then they were presented with this contract that I mentioned previously, but they got, they also were kind of forced into a press conference with Weber about this. And so things kind of spun off the rails, and George and Kathy Lutz became very uncomfortable with Weber. And the fact that I think the linchpin of it all is that they saw in the contract that Ronnie DeFeo was going to profit from this book venture as well. So essentially they were going to be helping Ronnie DeFeo profit from the murders, which was something they were comfortable with. So at that point, they stepped away and refused to engage with Weber. And a friend of George's named Tam Mossman, who was an editor for Prentice Hall, actually got them in touch with Jay Anson, or recommended Jay Anson, who was actually a writer of documentaries and a journalist, newspaperman, who had he felt would be a good choice, who ultimately was a good choice. But from that point, George and Kathy also recorded what they called their self-help tapes. They claimed they were going, they wanted to document everything they could remember that had happened to them in the house. And so they just went about recording everything they could remember in no real, linear fashion, just everything they could remember. And they ended up giving these tapes to Jay Anson, who created the timeline that we all know that the film was based on and everything else. But the book was crafted from this hodgepodge frame patchwork of memories that were recorded on tapes. They refused, they alleged, to be interviewed about anything. When the book came out, the book was used to illustrate, the fictional elements that Jay Anson injected into the story, and the timeline he sort of created based on these tapes was used to discredit the Lutzes. Like, this never happened. The police were never called to the house. There were all kinds of allegations that were made, and huge list. Basically, the book was used as like a proof of this was not true, which it's a novel. I mean, it's a horror novel.
Yeah, but when you look at the cover, it says a true story.
A true story.
There. And
that was part of the marketing, and it worked.
Yeah.
But the fact that I say in my afterword for this edition of the book is that, the tragedy of this is that George and Kathy went public with this in this way, in my view, and then allowed their children's actual names, Daniel, Christopher, and Melissa, to be used. So, they were forever and still are in this cloud of controversy. And there's this dark cloud of Amityville that's the only child, Melissa has seemed to move on from it, is a very private person, won't talk about it now, and has never been interviewed publicly about it, but has gone on the record, with other people who are close to the family and things in the years subsequent to say that, this thing, she did remember Jody was a real, all of these things really did happen. So each child has said that this was a real event in one way or another. I may not all agree, because I know when my documentary came out about Danny Lutz, certainly there was just so much, people, again, want it to be real. And when you watch this, some people came up to me during the festival run and were, moved to tears by what they had heard. Others were angry because they felt this guy was full of crap, and this is all not true, and this proves it's not true.
When you have Lorraine Warren open up that cross and say, this is a piece of the true cross, this was actually the cross, a piece that Jesus was nailed to, and to see how Danny reacts to that with tears and reverence, and he's moved beyond
which is why I kept it in the film, because I said, because initially we were, myself and the producers who worked on the film were arguing about that, whether to, is this getting off the track a little bit? To me, I felt, man, this was saying so much about his willingness to just accept at the drop of a hat that this was true. What else is he accepting? I'm the voice off camera getting yelled at, by the way, about my being an agnostic.
We were watching it and we were like, I wonder if he's the one getting yelled at, because if you had said, like, no, I'm a Catholic and I'm a believer and that is the true cross, your credibility is ruined. Like,
right.
Your objectivity, you are now like right there. People could take that as evidence of somebody who who's trying to make a case and make a point. But if you say you're agnostic, well, it doesn't mean you're not saying atheist. You're just saying like, I'm open to hearing what's going on.
That's I mean, in my view, and everyone's entitled to their own view, but that's the only place I can truly be coming from. I mean, I don't know. And in fact, my agnosticism in not only the Amityville case, but as well as just in religion and everyday life, in my own views, did initially, my relationship with Danny, that it wasn't an issue as we got to know each other, but initially he was very thrown off by the fact that I was not a religious person, which, told me something right off the bat, that if you want to be in an echo chamber and hear everything repeated back to you was true, I mean, maybe, I look, again, I want to be respectful to him too, because he has lived a lifetime of being told you're a fraud and that this didn't happen. And that, so I had to be aware of that and, kind of take myself out of the equation and know what it meant to him. But I wasn't going to waver on, I mean, I obviously succeeded in convincing him that, hey, as a documentarian, I have to be I have to have an objective view on this. And he wasn't even fazed by the sort of psychological angle of the film either, in terms of sitting with a, therapist and all of these other things, sitting or having Elizabeth Loftus talk about false memory. I mean, he might have been a little uncomfortable with that, truly, because he didn't agree with it. But it wasn't up to, ultimately it was my decision what to put in the film and what needed to be talked about. That is the thing that I'm very over everything, beyond the fact that, we've got Danny to talk about his memories of what happened in the house and everything. It was more of the topic that transcends the Amityville horror, the psychological, as I say in my, you keep referencing witness psychology. Really, that's where it came from, because a lot of and even in the new film that I've done and the subsequent one that I'm working on currently, have a lot of witness psychology analysis in them of stories that become sort of mythological.
So what is witness psychology? It's explain that.
I mean, to me, it's just more of a, again, as a documentarian, you're observing or you're listening to, we're documenting witnesses' testimony and their own view on what the place that they represent, or the story, the character. I mean, in Daniel Lutz's view, he is a character in this story. It was almost like a third person. I think as I remember it, the most fascinating scenes in My Amityville Horror was when he was sitting with that therapist talking about, and it's most heartbreaking too, just him talking about Daniel and Danny, like himself versus the character, and like not being able to, he had to fight to stay himself. And so that's what I sort of meant. I mean, the witness psychology is sort of a term I coined. That might not be completely true, because I actually think that it's defined somewhere. Someone can search that, but that's something that has come out in a lot of my work, because, and it will be once people see my next film.
I mean, how I took it is, it's the filter through which the story is told.
100%.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that's always I think the truth, everyone's truth is subjective. Everyone's truth is, Danny's truth was that this actually happened, and don't dare you question what happened, because I did. But
think about the hell he's been in. He think about the hell he's been in.
Sure.
Since his mom met George. He's
right.
He's fighting a literal ghost that he can't ever best. The man has passed away,
right,
and he's still dealing with that. And I think you did give him a great opportunity. And I'll tell you, short of killing someone, Danny gets a pass from me. Like, he totally does. What he's been through and what he continues to face. Right. Do you keep in touch with him?
Not as much these days. I had to put admittedly some distance, given the reaction to the film, and that he's so wound up in it. If anything, I'm pleased that the film did. It really woke it, it opened people's eyes to, again, not just Amityville, but any sort of witness person who goes through an event that is unexplained, that decides to go public and tries. I mean, the ramifications of this is something that are quite, that are worse than the unexplained events themselves in many ways. And so that's what I view. That's what upon my interest in going in and meeting Dan, to leaving that first meeting and being like, wow, this is not what I thought it was. And you had asked me some time ago about what is the initial spark or whatever causes you to make a film like this or something. It's just, you have a set of intentions, and they're usually completely, they evolve or they become something else. And that's part of your role as a documentary filmmaker, in my view, is to follow that story no matter where it takes you. And sometimes it takes you to places you don't want to go. To me, the closest you can get to the truth really is looking in that man's eyes. Something happened to these people, and I do believe that at the end of the day. And that's why I wanted to use the Errol Morris Interatron approach. If you're familiar with the camera looking straight down the pipe of the lens, him looking right into the lens, because I felt in my initial interviews with him that, man, there's no recreation or still photograph or piece of archival footage that I'm ever going to be able to present that's going to be unnerving as much as this guy looking right into the viewer. I think he also consequently is aware of his domineering presence too.
Yeah,
He sort of can tell a little
he leans
bit
into
in
it.
scene when he's really into, like, describing the infamous the window slamming down on his hands. He gets in this place, why are you making me do this? It feels a little bit, he's aware of his audience there.
Yeah, and I think so. You're going to have people approach it from one of those two doors, and they're gonna come at it. But I think the people who get the most out of it and appreciate it is when you focus on Danny and you see his blinking and his mouth ticks, and you could see a psyche boiling under the surface. And I think for anybody who gets you can get the most value out of the documentary by understanding whatever happened. There are very real results sitting in this chair. I did wonder, from your perspective, do you think these stories, with the saturation of everybody has a multimedia army in their pocket now,
right,
does it do cold cases and unexplained phenomena and mysteries? It doesn't seem like they end, but are they getting rarer?
Well, you wouldn't have. I mean, I've often said that you wouldn't if the Amityville Horror had taken place in the same time, the same events had happened today. The Lutzes would have a reality show,
Yeah, they would.
Or they would be on, the kids would be on, TikTok or Instagram posting about Jody the pig. I don't know. But this is, yes, our own ability to document things. I mean, it's been completely changed. This case would not happen the same way unless they were living in a vacuum and literally not online and literally not talking about, walking around with smartphones and our ability.
People would want to see the Ring camera footage. They'd be like, well, what? Okay, the dog hung himself and the garage door was opening and closing. Where's your Ring camera footage?
Right. What even affects topics like UFOs and the ability to, why haven't we, even though there have been a lot of interesting footage and photos that have been
developments,
things that have come out recently or more accepted in in different government circles, which is interesting. But getting away from that, yes, it is interesting that we haven't had as much documented. You'd think if this was going on as frequently as the Lutzes were talking about, that there would be documentation either by cell phones or in some other form, because of how many, because of just the world we're living in today. At some point maybe we'll have a time machine to go back to 1975 and see what was really going on. And I would love to see the day of that happening.
I think your instincts are spot on with going for witness psychology. That is, I think, not only are you're putting people in that spot, there's an immediacy to it, but also unpacking it through that person.
Right.
And I that that makes the story, at least if it's not explainable, we all get a window into it.
Well, you always have to wonder about, I mean, that's the first thing I wonder when I read a story that's interesting, or a paranormal account or something. Like, well, okay, how did it get to the place where it's on film, or it's on, on a page, in the pages of the book? Like, what filters has it gone through? I mean, it's a game of telephone.
I think that's why I loved My Amityville Horror so much, is that I didn't feel like I was getting propaganda or a mission or an agenda. I was presented, and I was allowed to say, okay, that's not actually the cross Jesus was nailed to. I'm sorry, I won't go there, but you know what? That's my job as the viewer to unpack that for myself, and let other viewers say, oh no, Lorraine Warren is the epitome of integrity, and I believe anything she says. Whatever.
I will say that was one of the most delightfully awkward and most memorable moments of my life. Well, just being in her, the occult museum / basement, or that's one of those wonderful things about documentary filmmaking that just narrative films can never offer, which was Danny walks in and she's got the roosters in the cages, and it's just like, there's just these wonderful things that are happening, and it's just these two people meeting that are, very interesting personalities. And when we were sitting, Danny's telling her about his experiences being out in the desert, and there's all this subtext of like what was going on in the desert, and like this winky nod stuff. And you can see Lorraine is increasingly becoming uncomfortable, because of course she was and I don't want to speak for her now. I mean, of course she's deceased, and she really truly was a lovely, I mean, despite my skepticism of some of the things that have been said about their cases, she was truly a very pleasant personality, and you couldn't help but enjoy her presence. I mean, she was a lovely person. Her reactions to Danny, as well as bringing that, she was afraid to bring out that, this cross, because there were people there who did not believe in God. She said that. I don't know if I should bring this out. That's what she was asking in the film. Yeah, that's right.
Right. But for me, the funniest moment was with Lorraine Warren looking skeptically at Danny about his roaming in the desert. When you got her to be skeptical of your story, that to me there was a whole bunch of worlds packed into that.
Well, it's interesting you say skeptical. I almost took it like shock, because I probably was going to say earlier, she was very aware of George's demeaning personality, and again, I don't want to get into some of the drama, but there were a lot of things that I heard that had happened behind the scenes with particularly, especially with George, these photographs that were taken on March 6, 1976 during the investigation of the house.
The boy
photographer that the Warrens had hired to come into the house and take these photographs. There's these famous black and white photographs were taken that night when they were conducting a seance and a search of the house and conducting investigation. Her and Ed, as well as representatives of Duke University's parapsychology department, as well as various other people from the media, Channel 5 News, Laura DiDio, who also wrote the introduction for this edition of the book, as well as Marvin Scott. So there was this whole, Laura has termed it the psychic slumber party. So anyway, there was all these photographs taken that night, and George had basically was sent the negatives of these photos back in in the late 70s, and basically kept those photographs for himself. So I think there were some disagreements and some feelings, because Lorraine I found out, even being there, that those photographs have never been returned to them. They had hired the photographer. And so anyway, there was like certainly some awareness of how combative George could be, or that,
okay.
And so I think that was, and that might be my own nuancy little take on it, but I felt that in that moment where Lorraine was sort of looking like, Danny ran away from home, was in the desert, and What were you doing there? And that's what I was seeing. Yeah, there was it was a delightful awkwardness, as I said, that was no, we successfully kept them away from each other until the cameras rolled, and all of that just came out. And you just can't make this stuff up.
But you mentioned two things. That you said there's something you're working on, and is that not the dark side of the mountain? Because
Well, Dark Side of the Mountain is finished. So
Right.
we are now, so we've just started, we're submitting to festivals now. So I'm waiting to hear back on all that. So that's where I'm
Okay.
at. So that by the time people hear this or whatever, we may know something more. I don't know.
Well, I liked it on Facebook. I recommend.
Oh, thank you.
I looked at the website. Really intriguing story. And
Yeah.
I'm very curious to see.
Well, it's a little bit of, as I mentioned, yeah. So the short version of it is essentially a gentleman named Keith Reinhardt, who was a journalist for a newspaper in suburban Chicago, moved to this town of Silver Plume, Colorado, in 1988, in June of 1988, and began writing a novel about a gentleman he knew, an acquaintance in the town, who was named Tom Young, who had a bookshop in this town. And mind you, Silver Plume is a town of 100 people.
Wow.
Just over 100 people, straight out of a Stephen King novel.
Yeah.
Former, during the 50s got down to like 50 people. Like it was a former silver mining town in the 1880s that, during the silver crash was abandoned. And this town has some interesting characters living there. And so it's, windswept, dusty streets, old Western saloon style buildings everywhere, kind of in dilapidated form. And so it, again, straight out of a Stephen King book. But it was, one of these buildings housed a bookshop for this gentleman named Tom Young. And Tom had ran this bookshop for many years, for over a decade. And in September of 1987, had come up missing under strange circumstances, and no one can explain. He had told friends that he was going to Europe. He had done that every year. And subsequently, they went looking for him at his house, and they found his passport, and they found other things to, suggest that he hadn't gone anywhere. His dog, he had this black lab, Gus, who was always at his side, a faithful dog who, they had not been put in the kennel or, nothing. So they don't know where he and the dog had both disappeared. And so Keith Reinhardt, this journalist I mentioned, had been coming to Silver Plume for years and actually knew the owner of the building that the bookshop had occupied. And so the owner of the building, his friend, childhood friend of Keith's, had vacated this shop, and Keith Reinhardt was approaching his 50th birthday and was kind of going through like a midlife crisis a bit. He was having some problems, just wanted to write a novel and wanted to kind of restart his life, and was frustrated living in, near the city, and was just wanted to get away. And so he left his wife of 3 years behind in Chicago and moved to Silver Plume, took a leave of absence from his job at the newspaper, and moved into this vacated storefront where Tom had his bookshop, and began writing a novel inspired by Tom's disappearance, and began investigating and this disappearance of Tom with everyone in town, talking with people. And again, a lot of these people, and they didn't want this guy coming to town investigating this and talking to people about what happened. And there was a lot of, again, as we talked about, just swirling questions, and a lot of mythos were already being created in Tom's story, because Tom Young was had been in Army Special Forces. There were different things he were involved with to make people speculate that, he must have been murdered because he had knowledge of this is how these stories get started in a small town. But Tom would remain missing for 11 months. And so the time while Keith was there working and investigating the story and writing this novel, and Keith's, I should mention, his novel, he was sort of creating this fictional story of Tom interlaced with his own personality. And he made up this crazy character named Guy Gypsum, who represented this, a composite character of Keith and Tom together. And he was writing about, and this is what he was writing, this story. And it was like almost like a mirror image of what Tom's life had been in the town. He was writing this novel, and then suddenly, lo and behold, on July 31st of 1988, Tom and his dog's skeletal remains were found on the mountain outside of town by two hunters who had just discovered, were scouting for elk, and had discovered the remains, and both had been shot in the head.
Wow.
A weapon was found on the scene with the shells out in the box, and it had, the police had determined that it was a suicide, but there was always a question about, no one knew why Tom would have committed suicide, or what was going on, or, there was no indication to say. A lot of people were skeptical of this. So this was going on in the town at the time. People were shocked and reeling. Literally, they buried Tom on that following Wednesday. He was found on a Sunday. The very following Sunday, Keith Reinhard up and announced that he was going to hike to the top of this mountain, Pendleton Mountain, which is out, a 12,500 foot mountain peak outside of town. The town of Silver Plume itself is at 9,100 feet.
Wow.
So Keith announced that he was going to go for this hike. He left at 5 p.m. Keith had a fear of heights. He had gone to this town and had other incidents with his friends where he was hiking up that same mountain, and he was so terrified clinging to a tree, because I've been up there, and it's this, this peak can get to like 50-degree incline.
Wow.
And he had gotten so, he had been up there and been so frightened, they thought he was going to have a helicopter come save him, and eventually they coerced him down. But why you would go up there at 5 o'clock really makes no sense. But he was going around town telling different people, some of which he didn't even know, like making a point they knew he was going up here at 5 o'clock. Well, he never came back. So we have a second missing person in the town.
Oh, gosh.
There was this enormous search and rescue operation that was launched for Keith, which resulted a 7-day, hundreds of people scouring the mountain looking for him. Nothing was ever found, but a plane had actually crashed, or a plane that was, a Cessna plane was flying low, had crashed into trees and killed the pilot and severely injured the spotter that was, sitting with him. So there was a death attributed in the search for him. So all kinds of questions began circling about Keith. Was he high? Had he staged this disappearance? Because during the investigation for this, they went into his computer to see what he was writing, and his, this document was quite fascinating, which part of what my film will reveal, or what this really said. And only this case has been profiled was profiled in 1990 by Unsolved Mysteries, the original Robert Stack Unsolved Mysteries. Yeah. They only mentioned, one significant line, which was the very ending of the novel, which it said that Guy Gypsum, this character he was writing about, understood Tom's motivation now and walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above. So it almost described what he did the day he disappeared.
Wow.
And so a lot of people in town felt Keith had staged this and had left, because they felt Tom had staged his own, had left all this trail and then gone and killed himself. Did Keith leave a trail and then go kill himself too? He was apparently depressed and having problems as well. Or was he murdered by the same person who murdered Tom Young? Or were these two things completely separated and not related at all? But in this town of Silver Plume, there have been other mysteries. And this is part of what I've uncovered and taken years to do so. There was a gentleman named Clifford Griffin who in 1887 had killed himself, had shot himself up on the mountain. And then his death, no one believed that it was a suicide. It became this murder story and turned into a ghost story. So you have and both Tom and Keith were aware of this story. They were both fascinated with this case, by the way, which is fascinating in of itself. So you have this kind of cyclical, repetitious weirdness going on in this town. And it's sort of this microcosm of again, the mythos that gets started. So in terms of everything we just talked about with My Amityville Horror, this new documentary that I've done is really sort of a commentary in a larger fashion on how these stories unravel. And, spin out of control. And even to the point that the family, Reinhardt's family, which I've grown close with doing this film, but they even believe a lot, certain members of the family believe a lot of the more outlandish claims, which I'll hold off for now talking about. But there's
Please,
a lot.
yes, don't spoil it.
There's a lot of conspiratorial murder plot theories that have gotten woven into this, that have created all this drama around it, that I tend to be more objective about. And even if it was all a coincidence, there's a lot of bizarre coincidences woven into a certain 1 week's period of time that is hard to explain away.
I can't wait to see this. I really cannot wait to see it. I think you handled, and I will say, you handled a cumbersome. You were carrying, when you did My Amityville Horror, you were carrying about 40 years of history on your shoulders, and preconceived notions, and everybody has an opinion on this topic. To take that on is super brave, and you did it deftly, and I think you gave the case to people in a very honest and powerful way, and
Thank you.
I appreciated the things you kept in there. So I have every confidence that this next piece will be something I'll completely enjoy. And you said you're shopping it around the festivals. So are you looking for a theatrical release, or like, how does that work?
We'll see. With any independent venture, you sort of have to kind of go at the whims of what is acceptable, or what makes the most sense of it. I would think, the streaming distribution would be where we'd eventually land. Yeah. But I'm open to, that's my goal in terms of it. But right now, we're going to be doing the festival circuit. So anybody who's interested, definitely check us out. The title of the film is Dark Side of the Mountain, which is actually a line from Keith's novel that he was writing about Tom.
That is a great, I think that's a great title.
The website is darksidedoc.com, as well as you can find us on Facebook and most social media platforms. But we'll be making an announcement, intimately about, where we're going to be premiering. So there's much to come. So I'd love to come back and chat with you when we.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Jeff.
Thank you, and I'll be a fan.
All right, man.
All right,
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.